It was one of those summer nights where nobody had any plans, so we all ended up at the lake. Everyone just called it Miller's Lake, though I don't think anyone knew who Miller was. It wasn't far from town, maybe a 20-minute drive down some back roads, and it had this little beach area where people went to hang out. It wasn't exactly legal, but nobody cared. The cops hardly ever showed up, and when they did, they usually just told us to keep it down. The lake had a bit of a reputation. There were always these stories about weird things happening there. Some people said it was haunted. Others said there was something in the water. Stuff like that. But nobody really believed it. It was just a place to drink, mess around, and maybe go for a swim if you were feeling brave enough to deal with the cold water. That night, it was the usual crowd. Me, Derek, Jess, a couple of others. Maybe 15 people in total. Someone had a Bluetooth speaker blasting music, and there was a cooler full of beer and cheap wine coolers. It was just one of those nights. I remember Jess talking about the lake's urban legends while we were sitting by the fire. She was into that kind of stuff. Ghost stories, creepy YouTube videos, all that. They say the lake is bottomless, she said, poking at the fire with a stick, like it just keeps going down forever. Derek laughed. That's not how lakes work, Jess. I'm just saying what I heard, she said, shrugging. And supposedly back in the 50s a kid drowned here, but they never found his body. That's every lake, Derek said. There's always a story like that. It was all typical campfire talk. Nobody took it seriously. I wasn't really paying attention anyway. I was more focused on Jess. I liked her, but I wasn't sure if she knew that. We'd been friends for a while, and I didn't want to mess that up by saying something stupid. So I just sat there, drinking my beer and listening to her talk. Then Kyle showed up. Kyle was one of those guys who thought he was better than everyone else. He wasn't part of our usual group, but he'd show up to things like this sometimes, uninvited. He played football, had that kind of cocky jock attitude, and always seemed to be looking for a fight. "What's up, losers?" he said, strolling up to the fire like he owned the place. He had a beer in one hand and a smirk on his face. "You guys having a little story time?" Nobody said anything, but you could feel the mood shift. Kyle had a way of killing the vibe. He plopped down on one of the logs near the fire and looked around. "Who's ready to do something fun?" "We're good, man," Derek said. "Why don't you just chill?" "Chill? Come on, this is boring. Let's do something." He looked right at me. "How about a race?" "What?" I said, caught off guard. "A swimming race," Kyle said, grinning. "To the dock and back. Unless you're scared." There was a dock out in the middle of the lake. It was probably 100 yards from the shore, maybe more. People used it to jump off or just hang out. I'd swum out to it a few times before, but never at night. The thought of swimming in that dark water, with who knows what below the surface, was scary, to say the least. "I don't know," I said. "It's kinda cold." "Come on," Kyle said. "Don't be a pussy." "Kyle, give it a rest," Jess said, rolling her eyes. "What?" "I'm just trying to make things interesting," Kyle said. Then he looked at me again. "What do you say, man? You scared?" Everyone was watching now. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting to see what I'd do. I didn't want to give Kyle the satisfaction of backing down, but I also didn't want to swim out there. Then Jess smiled at me and said, "You can take him." I don't know why, but that was all it took. "Fine," I said, standing up. Let's do it. Kyle laughed. That's what I'm talking about. He started taking off his shirt. Let's make this fair. Down to our boxers. No excuses. I hesitated for a second, then pulled off my shirt and jeans. The night air was cool against my skin, and I could feel goosebumps forming on my arms. Kyle tossed his beer can into the fire and walked down to the water's edge. I followed him, trying not to think about what I was getting myself into. Kyle shouted, "Go!" and dove into the water, disappearing under the surface for a moment before popping up, already pulling ahead. I followed, the cold hitting me like a punch. It felt worse the second time, like the lake itself was trying to push me back. I focused on the dock ahead, forcing myself to keep swimming. The water was darker than it should have been, almost black, and I couldn't tell how deep it was. Every stroke felt heavier than the last, but I pushed through, not letting myself look back. Kyle's voice came from somewhere ahead of me. "Is that all you've got?" I didn't answer. My arms and legs were burning and my lungs felt tight, but I kept going. The dock was closer now, close enough to make out its warped wooden slats in the dim light. I swam harder, forcing my body to keep moving. When my hands finally hit the edge of the dock, I grabbed on and hauled myself up. I rolled onto my back, gasping, my chest heaving. The night air felt colder now that I was soaked, but it was a relief compared to the water. I sat up, looking back at the lake. Kyle wasn't far, maybe 15 feet away. But something was wrong. He wasn't swimming smoothly anymore. His strokes were erratic, and he kept glancing down at the water, jerking his legs like he was trying to shake something off. "Kyle, what are you doing?" I said. He didn't answer right away. Then, loud and clear, he shouted, "Help me!" I froze. The way he said it wasn't like him. Kyle never asked for help, not like that. He was thrashing now, his arms flailing, his body twisting in the water. "What's wrong?" I said. "I'm stuck," he yelled. His voice was strained, panicked. "The weeds, they're wrapped around my legs." My jaws clenched. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "Just pull yourself free." "I can't." His voice cracked, and he lunged forward like he was trying to crawl through the water, but it didn't work. He wasn't moving. I stood on the edge of the dock, my heart pounding. He was too far for me to reach, but I couldn't just stand there and do nothing. "Hold on," I shouted, diving back in. The cold slammed into me again, making me gasp, but I forced myself to swim toward him. He was struggling harder now, his movements frantic. "Hurry up," he yelled, his voice raw. I stopped a few feet away. "Stay still," I said. "I'm coming." He kept thrashing, his arms splashing water into my face. I dove under, feeling my way toward his legs. The water was thick and black, and I couldn't see anything. My hands found his ankle, and I felt it. Something slimy, coiled tight around his leg. It was pulling him down. I yanked at it, trying to rip it free, but it wouldn't budge. It was stronger than it should have been, thicker than any plant I'd ever seen. I came back up, gasping. "Stop kicking," I said. "I can't," he shouted. He was spluttering now, barely keeping his head above water. His eyes locked on mine, wide and terrified. "It's pulling me under." I dove back down, grabbing at the weeds with both hands. They felt alive, like they were tightening every time I tried to loosen them. The more I pulled, the more tangled they became, wrapping around his other leg and creeping higher. Kyle's hand grabbed my shoulder, his grip so tight it hurt. He was using me to stay above water, but his weight was dragging me down with him. I shook him off and came up for air. "You have to stop moving," I shouted. "I'm not trying to." His voice cracked, and I could hear the desperation in it. "It's pulling me. Get it off me." I went under again, pulling at the weeds with everything I had. My hands slipped on their slimy surface, and I could feel them moving, tightening, like they were fighting back. Kyle's legs were covered now. The weeds coiled around his thighs, dragging him deeper. When I came up, his head was barely above the surface. "Don't let go," he said, his voice shaking. "I'm not," I said, grabbing his arm. I could feel him slipping, his body sinking lower with every second. His eyes met mine again, and for a moment, neither of us moved. His face was pale, his lips trembling, and I could see it in his expression. He didn't think he was getting out of this. "I don't want to die," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Kyle's grip on my arm tightened, and he tried to pull himself up, but it was no use. The weeds were up to his chest now, winding around his ribs. "Please," he said, his voice breaking. "Please don't let me go." "I won't," I said, yanking at the weeds with one hand while holding on to him with the other. But they wouldn't let go. He started sinking faster. I tried to hold him up, but he was too heavy, and the weeds were too strong. His face went under, and I grabbed him by the shoulders, pulling him back up. He gasped for air, coughing and choking. "Don't let me go," he screamed, his voice hoarse. "I'm trying," I shouted, but it wasn't enough. The weeds pulled harder, dragging him down inch by inch. His head went under again, and this time, he didn't come back up. I dove after him, my hands reaching through the dark water. I found his face, his eyes wide and staring. He wasn't fighting anymore. The weeds were wrapped around his neck now, pulling him deeper. I grabbed him, trying to pull him back up, but it was like trying to lift a boulder. The weeds wouldn't let go. Kyle's eyes met mine one last time, and I'll never forget the look on his face. He wasn't angry or scared anymore, just resigned. His mouth opened, bubbles streaming out, and then he was gone. The weeds dragged him into the blackness, and no matter how hard I swam after him, I couldn't see him anymore. It was like the lake had swallowed him whole. I floated there for a moment, staring at the empty water where Kyle had been, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. My chest was heaving, and my legs were burning. But none of that mattered. All I could think about were his eyes as he disappeared. How wide they were. How they begged me for something I couldn't give. Then something slimy brushed against my ankle. I didn't think. I kicked hard and started swimming back to the dock, pushing through the water as fast as I could. My arms felt like they might give out, but I didn't stop. Every few strokes, I felt the weeds again, brushing against my legs, curling around my ankles. Each time I kicked them off, harder and harder, until my legs ached from the effort. It felt like the lake was alive, like it didn't want me to leave. I kept my head down, focused on the dock, and swam until my fingers slammed into the wood. I pulled myself up, shaking so hard I could barely get a grip, and crawled onto the dock on my hands and knees. I lay there for a second, gasping for air, staring up at the stars. The night was so quiet now. The sounds of the party drifted over the water. Music, laughter, the crackle of the fire. And I realized I wasn't safe yet. I forced myself to my feet, my legs trembling, and dove back into the water. The swim to shore felt longer than it should have, like the lake was stretching itself out just to keep me in it. My limbs felt heavier with every stroke, and my mind kept replaying Kyle's face, the moment he was pulled under, the way he looked at me like he knew it was over. When my feet finally hit the muddy bottom near the shore, I stumbled out of the water, barely able to stand. My legs were shaking, and my breaths came in sharp, shallow gasps. The fire was still burning, and the group was still gathered around it, their voices rising and falling in bursts of laughter. I stood there for a moment, dripping wet, staring at them. Nobody had noticed me yet. Jess was sitting on one of the logs talking to Derek. Someone was poking at the fire with a stick, and the Bluetooth speaker was still blasting music. It was like nothing had happened. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. Everyone turned to look at me. Jess frowned. "Where's Kyle?" I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. My throat felt tight, and my head was spinning. Derek stood up, holding his beer. "What happened? Did he chicken out or something?" I shook my head, trying to find the right words. He didn't make it." "What do you mean?" Jess said, standing now too. "The weeds," I said, the words coming out in a rush. "They pulled him under. He got stuck and I couldn't." I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The group stared at me. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then one of the guys laughed, a short, nervous sound. "Come on, man. That's not funny." "I'm not joking," I said, my voice louder now. Jess stepped closer, her face pale. "You're serious?" "I tried to help him," I said, looking at her. "I swear, I tried, but I couldn't get him out. The weeds, they wouldn't let go." The nervous laughter stopped. Derek frowned and looked out at the lake. "So what? He's still out there?" I nodded. The group fell silent. The fire crackled, and the music from the speaker sounded too loud now, out of place. Jess turned toward the water, wrapping her arms around herself. "We need to call the cops," she said quietly. Derek nodded, pulling out his phone. The rest of the group stood there, staring at the lake like they expected Kyle to come walking out of it at any moment. Nobody said a word. I sat down on one of the logs, my body still shaking. My hands were trembling so bad I could barely hold the beer someone handed me. It tasted sour, but I drank it anyway, hoping it would settle my nerves. The cops showed up fast, their flashlights cutting through the dark as they made their way down to the shore. 2 officers approached me first, their faces serious. "You were swimming with him?" one of them asked. I nodded. "What happened?" I tried to explain, but the words felt wrong as I said them. "We were racing to the dock. He got stuck in the weeds. They wrapped around him and I couldn't get him free." The officers exchanged a look. "Weeds," one of them said. I nodded again. "We'll have divers check it out," the other one said. The divers went into the water, their flashlights bobbing as they searched. I watched them, my stomach churning, knowing they wouldn't find him. Hours passed and the sun started to rise. The divers came back empty-handed. One of the officers came over to me, his face tired. "We'll keep searching, but it's probably a drowning," he said. "It happens more often than people think." I didn't argue. I didn't tell him about the way the weeds moved, the way they tightened around Kyle like they were alive. I didn't tell him about the look on Kyle's face when he disappeared into the blackness. The group started to leave, one by one, until it was just me and Jess sitting by the burned-out fire. "You did everything you could," she said quietly. I didn't answer. The lake was calm now, the water smooth and still. But I couldn't stop thinking about Kyle, about how he begged me not to let go, about how he looked at me like I was supposed to save him. And I couldn't stop thinking about the weeds, how they felt in my hands, how they wouldn't let him go no matter how hard I tried. I didn't go back to the lake after that night. The police kept their search going for a few days, but they didn't find anything. No body, no trace of Kyle. They said it was probably the currents. He got tangled up in weeds, got tired, and sank somewhere too deep to recover. I didn't argue with them, but that explanation didn't sit right with me. For the first few weeks, I had trouble being around anyone from the group. Everyone was shaken up, but people moved on faster than I expected. They stopped talking about Kyle. They started meeting up again at other places, parks, someone's backyard, but it wasn't the same. Jess tried to reach out a few times, asking how I was doing. She even stopped by my house once, but I didn't know what to say to her. After a while, the messages stopped. It wasn't anything dramatic. We just drifted apart. By the end of that summer, I was spending most of my time alone, counting down the weeks until I could leave for college. But leaving didn't help much. The nightmares started almost right away. There were 2 of them. They always came the same way, right as I was falling asleep, when the edge between waking and dreaming was so thin that it felt like I wasn't dreaming at all. In one dream, I was lying in my dorm room bed, staring up at the ceiling, unable to move. The air felt heavy, like the room was filling with water, pressing down on my chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. At first, everything seemed normal, but then I'd hear it, the faint, wet sound of something dripping. It came from the window. I couldn't turn my head to look, but I knew it was there. The dripping got louder, each drop splashing onto the floor like something was leaking into the room. Then, slowly, the window would creak open, though there was no breeze to move it. And that's when he floated in. Kyle's body, or what was left of it. His skin was pale and bloated, sagging off his bones in places, and dark green patches of rot spread across his chest and neck. His arms hung limp at his sides, the fingers bent at unnatural angles. Water streamed from his open mouth, spilling in endless rivulets that splashed onto the floor. But his eyes were the worst. Or what should have been his eyes. 2 dark, empty sockets that seemed to look straight into me, even though they weren't there. He drifted closer, his movements slow and jerky, like he was being pulled on invisible strings. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even blink. My chest felt tight, and my arms were pinned to my sides, as if the weight of the entire lake was pressing down on me. By the time his face was inches from mine, I could see every detail. His jaw was locked in a scream, stretched so wide I thought his face might split apart. But there was no sound, not a breath, not a moan, just the sound of dripping water. And then the weeds started. They slid out of his mouth first, thin black tendrils that writhed like worms, dripping with dark water. They poured from his eye sockets, twisting and coiling together, crawling over his face and neck like they were alive. I tried to thrash to push them away, but my body wouldn't respond. The first tendril touched my cheek, cold and slimy, and I wanted to scream. It slithered down my neck, leaving a trail of icy wetness, and then another joined it, and another. They moved slowly, winding around my arms, my chest, my legs, until I could feel them everywhere. The weight pressed harder, and the weeds began to tighten, constricting like they were trying to pull me into him. Kyle's face was still hovering above mine, that silent scream frozen in place. Water dripped from his chin, into my mouth and eyes. It tasted foul, like rot and decay, and I wanted to gag, but I couldn't even do that. The worst part was the silence. It was absolute, suffocating. No matter how much I tried to scream, no sound came out. No matter how loud my heart pounded in my chest, I couldn't hear it. The only thing I could hear, or maybe feel, was Kyle's presence, pressing down on me, suffocating me. That and the dripping. Then, just as the weeds started to slide over my throat, I'd wake up. I'd gasp for air, drenched in sweat, my chest heaving like I'd just come up from the bottom of the lake. For the first few seconds, I wouldn't know where I was. I'd check the window, expecting it to be open, expecting to see him hovering there. Sometimes I'd even feel the phantom sensation of the weeds still on my skin, cold and slimy, like they'd left a mark. I stopped sleeping with the window open. The other dream was different, but it always started the same way. I'd wake up in my bed, staring up at the ceiling, unable to move. Everything would feel normal for a moment, but then this feeling of dread would fill my entire body. My chest felt heavy, my arms pinned at my sides. I told myself it was just sleep paralysis, that I wasn't really awake. The light in the room wasn't right. It wasn't coming from my lamp or the hallway, but from somewhere above, faint and distant, a bluish glow that shimmered like sunlight on water. Shadows rippled across the ceiling, distorted and uneven, and the air around me felt heavy and cold, pressing into my skin like damp fabric. I'd try to turn my head, to look at anything other than the ceiling, but my body wouldn't respond. My breaths came in shallow gasps, the weight in my chest growing heavier with every second. And then I'd see the first bubbles. They floated past my face, tiny and silver, rising in slow motion toward the ceiling, or what should have been the ceiling. The realization hit me all at once. I wasn't in my room anymore. I was underwater. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to move, but I couldn't. I was trapped, lying flat on my back, my bed somehow resting on the bottom of an impossibly deep lake. The light above me was so far away, it looked like a pinprick, barely enough to illuminate the vast, endless blackness that surrounded me. The water was heavy and cold, its weight pressing against me from every direction, squeezing the air from my lungs. I felt small, insignificant, like I was nothing more than a speck at the bottom of the universe. The darkness stretched in every direction, infinite and empty, swallowing everything. My bed felt absurdly out of place, reminding me how far I was from anything safe or normal. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat, swallowed by the water. More bubbles escaped my lips, drifting upward, twisting and distorting as they vanished into the void. And then the sense of scale hit me. It wasn't just the depth of the lake. It was the sheer enormity of it. The knowledge that I was trapped in something so vast and incomprehensible that I couldn't even begin to understand it. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mind raced, trying to make sense of it, But the more I thought about it, the worse it got. I started to feel movement, not from me, but from something else, something massive and far away. The water shifted, rippling in waves that I couldn't see but could feel, deep in my bones. A shadow passed above me. It was enormous, so large I couldn't see the edges of it, only the faint dark blur as it moved across the faint light above. My chest tightened, and the air caught in my throat. Whatever it was bigger than anything I'd ever seen, and it wasn't alone. More shadows followed, drifting silently through the water, their forms indistinct but undeniably massive. I wanted to run, or to wake up, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even close my eyes. All I could do was lie there, pinned to the bed, as the shadows swirled around me, their presence so immense that it felt like they could crush me without even noticing. The light above grew dimmer, as though the surface was moving farther and farther away. The weight of the water pressed harder, and my lungs screamed for air. I tried to thrash, to scream, to do anything, but I couldn't. Just as I realized I wasn't going to make it out, that I was going to be stuck here, at the bottom of this endless dark lake, alone and forgotten, I'd feel the tendrils of the weeds creeping over my body, lashing me to the bed. They swallowed me whole. I woke up. I started to fear water. It got to the point where I hated even seeing lakes or ponds. Once during my first year of college, some friends invited me to a cabin for the weekend. When I saw the lake behind it, I made up an excuse and left before they could unpack. Over the years, I got better at pushing it down. I stopped talking about it, stopped thinking about it as much. The nightmares didn't stop, but they became less frequent. I told myself it was just a bad memory, something I couldn't change. I wasn't sure I believed that, but it was easier than trying to make sense of it. Then, a few years after college, I came back to my hometown for the holidays. I hadn't planned to stay long, just a couple of days to visit my parents and a few old friends. But on my second night, I found myself driving past the lake. It looked the same as it always had. The trees around it were taller, and the gravel parking lot had more potholes. But the lake itself hadn't changed. It was calm and quiet, with the moonlight reflecting off its surface. I parked the car and sat there for a while, staring out at the water. I told myself it was just a lake. Whatever happened that night, it didn't mean the water was cursed or haunted or alive. But even as I thought it, my chest felt tight, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Eventually, I got out of the car. I didn't plan to go near the water. I just wanted to clear my head. I started jogging along the path that circled the lake, the cold night air stinging my lungs. The sound of my shoes crunching against the gravel helped drown out the memories, at least for a little while. I don't know how long I ran, but at some point, I stopped to catch my breath. The lake was to my right, dark and still, the trees casting long shadows over the water. I turned away from it, trying not to look, but then I heard it. A splash. It cut through the quiet like a knife. I turned back to the lake, my pulse quickening. For a moment there was nothing, just the ripples spreading out across the surface. Then I heard a voice. "Help! Somebody, please!" I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The voice was coming from farther down the shore. I started running, my legs shaking with every step. When I reached the spot, I saw a girl standing at the edge of the water. She couldn't have been older than 17, with her arms crossed tight over her chest. Her face was pale, and she looked like she was on the verge of tears. "What happened?" I asked. She pointed to the lake, her hand trembling. "My boyfriend. He swam out there and he's not coming back. I don't know what to do." I stared at the water. It was too dark to see anything, but I thought I heard faint splashing farther out. "How long has he been out there?" I said. "I don't know," she said, her voice cracking. "He just wanted to swim to the middle and back. I told him not to, but he didn't listen." I looked at the girl again. She was shaking now, hugging herself like she was trying to hold herself together. I wanted to tell her it was going to be okay, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stepped closer to the water. "You're not going in there, are you?" she said, her voice rising. I didn't answer. My body felt like it was moving on its own, my mind racing back to that night, to Kyle, to the weeds. Every instinct was telling me to turn around and leave, but I couldn't. Whoever was out there didn't have much time. I dove in. I thought I was prepared, but the cold hit harder than I expected, like thousands of needles stabbing into my skin at once. The shock almost stopped me, but I forced myself forward, kicking hard and pulling at the water with both hands. The girl's panicked cries faded behind me as I focused on the frantic splashing ahead. The sound was desperate, the kind of noise someone makes when they know they're drowning. Each stroke brought me closer, but the water felt heavier with every second, thick and suffocating, as if it were trying to hold me back. Then I saw him. His head bobbed just above the surface, hair plastered to his face, his mouth gasping for air before slipping under again. "Hold on," I shouted, though I wasn't sure he could hear me. I swam harder, my arms burning, until I was close enough to grab his arm. The second I touched him, he latched onto me, clawing at my shoulders like a wild animal. His nails raked across my skin, and his weight dragged me down with him. "Let go!" I shouted, choking as water splashed into my mouth. He didn't listen. He couldn't. His eyes were wide and unfocused, his mouth gaping like a fish's, trying to suck in air that wasn't there. I kicked hard, breaking the surface, and shoved him upward with one arm. Then, I noticed a shape floating in the water. It looked like a reflection of moonlight at first, but as it moved closer, I realized it wasn't just light. Kyle's bloated, rotting body was drifting just beneath the surface, his arms outstretched like he was swimming toward us. His face was locked in a silent scream, the jaw stretched impossibly wide, but no sound came. I froze in the water, staring at him. His hollow socket's eyes were black, festering with weeds. The tendrils slithered out of his mouth, twisting and curling, as if they were reaching for the boy. He floated around us like he was taunting me. My legs felt numb, but I forced myself to move, dragging the boy with me. I tried to block out Kyle's face, the way the water rippled around his swollen limbs, but he wouldn't leave. Every time I looked, he was closer, weeds trailing behind him like dead, rotting roots. I dove under, trying to untangle the weeds that had wrapped around the boy's neck and chest. They pulsed beneath my fingers, warm and alive, tightening with every second. Kyle's pale hand drifted into view, his bloated fingers brushing against my arm, and I almost let go out of sheer panic. But I didn't. I tore at the weeds, yanking them free one by one, until the boy's body jerked upward. His face was slack and pale, and his lips were turning blue. I surfaced, gasping, and pulled him with me, wrapping one arm around his chest and kicking with everything I had. My legs burned, and my arms felt like they might give out. But I kept going, the shore getting closer inch by inch. Kyle's hand grabbed my ankle, his fingers digging into my skin. The weight of it pulled me down, dragging the boy with me. I twisted, kicking at him with my free leg. For a moment his grip loosened, but then he grabbed me again, harder this time, his rotten face looming closer. I kicked again, my heel connecting with his arm, and his hand broke free. His body sank into the blackness, the weeds pulling him back, his face still locked in that horrible, silent scream. I didn't stop. I kicked and pulled, dragging the boy with me, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the water grew shallower. I could hear the girl screaming on the shore, her voice shrill and desperate, and I focused on that, forcing my body to keep moving. When my feet finally hit the muddy bottom, I stumbled onto the shore, collapsing to my knees with the boy still in my arms. His limp body slipped onto the ground beside me, his skin pale and cold, his lips dark and lifeless. The girl dropped to her knees next to us, sobbing. "Is he okay? Please tell me he's okay." I didn't answer. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely tilt his head back, my fingers fumbling as I checked for a pulse. There was nothing. "Call the police," I shouted, my voice hoarse. She fumbled with her phone, dialing with trembling hands as I leaned over him, pressing my mouth to his and forcing air into his lungs. His chest rose slightly, then fell again, lifeless. I pressed my hands to his chest, locking my elbows, and started compressions. "Come on," I muttered, my voice cracking. "Come on, damn it." The girl was on the phone now, crying and shouting something to the operator, but I wasn't listening. I kept pressing, my arms screaming with the effort, my breath coming in short gasps. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. I repeated the cycle, my mind racing, every second stretching out into eternity. And then he sputtered. Water burst from his mouth, and his body jerked violently. He rolled onto his side, coughing and choking, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. "Oh my God!" the girl cried, grabbing his face. I sat back, my arms limp at my sides, watching as he struggled to breathe. He was alive. I stared out at the lake, exhausted and in shock, the sound of the police sirens getting closer and closer. I couldn't shake the feeling that Kyle was watching. I thought I could escape the torment of that night when he drowned. Maybe I never will.